Hello, I'm Rudyard Griffiths, the host and moderator of the Monk Dialogues. Great to have you back with us here for another evening of civil and substantive conversation on the big issues of our time. Tonight, as we do in all these dialogues, we reflect on the effects and state of our world as it's impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. We're trying to do that in a way that allows for long-form conversation, that allows for a true exchange of ideas with you, the audience. Tonight, we're exceedingly fortunate to have as our guide to the future trajectory of this pandemic, its effects on everything from our politics to society to the global economy, one of the world's most astute public intellectuals. His name is Martin Wolf. He's the associate editor and chief economics commentator at the Financial Times of London. He's been lauded rightly as the Anglosphere's most influential financial journalist. He's a regular member of Foreign Policy Magazine's top 100 global thinkers and is the international best-selling author of a number of books. We've got some of those titles up for you on the screen now. They're all on my bookshelf. Make sure they're on yours too. Joining us on screen now, live, is Martin Wolf. Martin, great to have you on the Monk Dialogues.
It's a great pleasure.
Well, have been looking forward to this conversation for weeks now because you are a thinker that paints in both broad brushes, but does so with an awful lot of muscle memory, an awful lot of time thinking through the big forces and trends that are reshaping our world. So I want to kind of use you a little bit tonight as a kind of proverbial oracle of Delphi. I want you to help us predict into the future the impact of this pandemic, how it will reverberate in the months and years to come. And I want to do that by playing back to you some recent quotes, some recent statements that you've made on key features and facets of how this pandemic is affecting our world, and get your reaction to them, have you expand on them. So this is your comment you recently made on the future of the global economy. You said the world economy and most individual economies will probably be permanently smaller, and their peoples also poorer than they would have otherwise been as a result of COVID-19. Unpack that for us. What's the reasoning behind that case?
Well, first of all, it really is a great pleasure. I should note that before I get to the impact of the pandemic, that I was a classicist long before I became an economist. And one of the things I learned that the famous characteristic of the Delphic Oracle is that all its answers were ambiguous and as a result tended to be misleading. I hope that won't be the case today. So the argument here, and actually the latest World Economic Outlook of the International Monetary Fund brings this out, is that this crisis, which is very severe in terms of its economic impact, it's clearly going to be a much worse economic event in terms of world output, employment, and so forth than the global financial crisis, that it's going to have long-term effects, what economists tend to call scarring. And the scarring will occur in a number of different ways. Lots of businesses will close, many permanently. Enormous amounts of debt will be accumulated by both the private and the public sectors. And the private sector debt in particular will lead business to become more cautious. It will lead financial institutions to be more cautious about their lending. They will probably end up with a lot more bad debt and lose, therefore, a lot of their underlying capital, which will have to be replaced. People will lose jobs and be unemployed, and we know very well that has terrible effects on people's motivations, skills, and so forth. Investment will be reduced. It will be substantially lower than we'd expected. And while there will be some gains, most obviously the accelerated application of new technologies, which we're seeing, for example, in our exchange now, nonetheless, on balance, this scarring is likely to be long-term. It's very clear that now that the global financial crisis itself, as I said, a milder shock in many ways, had a very deep long-term effect on the developed countries that were most affected. They never really recovered the growth rates they expected before. In fact, the impact is dramatic. In the UK, for example, the economy, GDP per head, is probably about 20% below now what we thought it would be. Not now, just before the crisis, and we thought it would be, looking at pre-financial crisis trends. And the fear is this will happen again. And that is exactly what the IMF forecasts. It forecasts that, comparing its forecasts made in January 2020 of what GDP per head would be 6 years from now, 6 years, middle of this decade, roughly, comparing that with what it now expects, GDP per head will be significantly lower in both the advanced and emerging and developing countries than they expected. So this will be a 5 or 6 year effect, and it could well be substantially longer. And I think, unless things go sensationally right, and we are very, very fortunate, that's pretty well certain.
Martin, I think you bring up an important point, which was, growth was weak going into this crisis. So we now have the compounding effects of the crisis on top of a period of low growth. But why then this dichotomy between, I think, a very convincing case that you're painting here of a scarred global economy and financial markets hitting all-time highs? They would seem to be telegraphing or suggesting that there's a wave of economic growth and prosperity ahead based on the valuations of these major Western indices around North America and to some extent Europe.
Well, there are several elements here. The first point, which is, I think, a point Paul Krugman particularly likes to make, which happens to be true, is that the stock market is not the economy. So the stock market essentially is telling you what intelligent investors think the present value, the discounted present value of future profits is going to be. And profits accrue, of course, to the owners of capital. And that's very important. It's a driver of the economy. But actually, profits are quite a small part of the economy. Most of the economy consists of wages, even now, even in our more unequal times. And it is perfectly possible for profits to look wonderful and feel very confident about them when actually one expects real incomes to be stagnant. And I think that actually is rather a possible view of the future. And that links with the second fact, which is, if you start looking in stock market in detail, you discover that certain sectors have done vastly better than others. And the ones that have done particularly well are, of course, the tech sector, And that's a sector which employs very few people. It's strikingly different from the old dominant companies of 40, 50 years ago, the General Motors and so forth. The tech giants employ very few people. They employ no unskilled people. They earn enormous profits, a lot of which is, I think, variations on monopoly rent. So it is quite possible for them to be doing fantastically well without that actually leading to direct benefits to a large part of the public, except as consumers, I mean, in terms of real incomes. And then the final element in thinking about this, of course, is that, as I said, I mentioned the discount rate. The best discount rate is, of course, the real interest rate on safe borrowing, and the real interest rate on safe borrowing, which is government borrowing, is now negative, basically throughout the developed world. Well, if you discount future profits with a negative real interest rate, obviously the present value looks great. Essentially, the markets are able to borrow at well, this is an exaggeration because, of course, the private sector isn't, but the benchmark real rate is unprecedentedly low, negative. And that, of course, pushes up asset prices quite rationally. But that's a reflection of how terrible the times are. It's not a reflection of how good the times are. So for all these three reasons, and I could go further, but these are the main reasons, I just don't think the stock market tells you much. That it doesn't mean the stock market is incorrectly priced, by the way. I think it might be quite well priced, but it's not telling you anything useful about future economic prospects. And Donald Trump's insistence that we should look at the markets which are basically owned by the top 10% of income earners in our societies, that we should look at that. That's just not very sensible.
Excellent, good points. I recently saw that Zoom, the video conferencing company's market capitalization surpassed that of Exxon, and I think they employ something like 1/100th, the number of staff. So interesting to note how these big shifts are occurring before us in real time.
That's a very, very good point, and the comparison which I once did between Apple and General Motors is again very, very striking. And Apple, of course, is a dominant company of our time, and its impact on the economy is totally different from the big giants of old.
Martin, you're doing an excellent job as our oracle, picking through the proverbial chicken entrails here with us to prognosticate on the future. So let's go to your next forward-looking view, and this is on geopolitics. You wrote, trends in the direction of unilateralism and international conflict have been reinforced by the pandemic. The chances are good that this will get worse now, especially between the United States and China. Are you at all hopeful that the Biden administration could potentially create the opportunity to reset China-U.S. relations, or at least try to patch up, as you rightly point out, the cleavages that have opened up between the world's two great powers?
I think this is a very interesting question, and there's no secret I've written this. I like pretty well every non-American pro-Democrat. I'm very happy that Mr. Biden is president, and I think it can offer hope in some very important matters, which I'm sure we'll come to. So let me just break this out into two elements, because that particular quote linked two things. I assume that the Biden administration will, so far as it is able to and is allowed to by Congress, and it has some freedom, that it will be significantly less unilateralist and significantly more predictable than the Trump administration, particularly on things like trade, attitudes to the NATO treaty and its NATO allies, and indeed more broadly attitudes to the other great democracies. So I assume that what we used to call the West, although of course it included some very important Easterners like Japan and Korea and Australasia, of course, that will be reinforced in some ways, and that so that aspect of multilateralism will look stronger, and that it is also possible that Mr. Biden will want to use international institutions more effectively across the board. So try and go back into the WHO, return to the Paris Agreement, we expect that, return to the Iran Agreement, which after all was pushed by he himself in his previous incarnation as vice president, and the WTO. So that's important. However, you asked about another aspect of what the story, which is the relationships between the US and indeed the Western powers more broadly, as I've defined them, and China. And here I think there will be a change, but it won't be as fundamental. It seems to me, whether rightly or wrongly, and I understand why this has happened, though I worry about it, that the general attitude in the Western world, and I think it's affected you in Canada too, is of far greater suspicion and concern about China's role in the world, about China's future development, about China politically and socially as well as economically, about China's behavior in terms of the development of its economy, on intellectual property protection, on being essentially unfair in its treatment of foreigners, and of course, deep security concerns. So, and I think this is bipartisan in the United States. And as I indicated, I think it's actually, there's been a real shift in Europe too, though not as extreme. And I expect the Biden administration to reflect that. I don't think they will proceed in the same way. They won't be as unilateralist. As I indicated, they may try to create a coalition. They may be more focused on human rights issues, I think, which didn't really concern Mr. Trump at all, but which are in some ways even more non-negotiable. But I think the general tenor of relations with China are now going to be ones of significant suspicion, significant concern, significant rivalry, even to the point of trying to create a coalition. And you can see who the members of that coalition might be against China pretty well across the board. And I do think we can expect that. So, not entirely dissimilar objectives pursued with slightly or not insignificantly different means.
Martin, give us a sense of the Chinese reaction to that. How do you think the Chinese will respond to, look, I don't want to mischaracterize it, but a league of democracies, some form of organized opposition to their rise as a great power?
I think that's a fascinating question. And though I've spent a lot of time with Chinese officials over the years, I wouldn't begin to claim that I understand in full what might be going on behind the scenes here. I think there are, again, several elements of this. First, I suspect, more than suspect, that there are a number of people fairly high up in China, not the current leadership, who sort of think Mr. Xi has been pushing his luck a bit, that he has been ceasing to hide his light under a bushel, as it were, reversing Deng Xiaoping's mantra about how China should rise in a rather destabilizing and possibly unproductive way. From the Chinese point of view, I think this myself anyway, and I think I certainly know Chinese people who think this too, that, if you take the view that China is bound to emerge as the world's greatest power, just numbers and talent show that, then the sensible thing is to be very, very, very peaceful and bide your time until it's so obvious nothing can be done about it. And in that respect, Mr. Xi went too soon in many ways, when actually China was not yet as dominant as it needs to be to have any hope of pulling this off, because though China is a vast power and in some respects a match of the US, in most respects it's not really yet a match of the US, and it's certainly not a match in significance and weight of the whole, what you call, League of Democracies. So that's the first issue. So maybe they will decide, actually, we should pull back a bit. Let's calm down. Let's calm it down, because things are basically fine. Let's reduce the tensions. And then that links with the other part of your very interesting question. If the West, and this really then really centers on what the Chinese think the West's aim is, which we haven't discussed. Now, and you can think of the West having two different aims. One aim is possibly three. One is actually to stop China's development, and basically to ensure it remains permanently inferior. And I think that it is absolutely inconceivable that the Chinese government will ever accept that as a legitimate goal, and it will do everything it can to prevent it. And that's perfectly understandable. So would we. But they might interpret the West's objectives here as making China's rise more compatible or less incompatible with the security and stability of Western economies and Western society, and by making China better integrated into the legal structure of the world order, more compatible, say, with WTO rules, more open, more predictable, more law governed, all these sorts of things, which sometimes somebody like Robert Lighthizer, the USTR, seems to be aiming for. And there are plenty of Chinese people who think that will be good for China, and they should go for that. So if that's what we are trying to do, then it might be that the Chinese leadership will respond in ways that turn out to be productive. And in that respect, the very bilateral, at least it's always been my view, that the bilateralism of the US approach is so counterproductive, because if the Americans come along with a whole set of demands which they insist the Chinese must obey at once, it looks so humiliating. And it's very difficult. And we know that's been part of the difficulty. It's very difficult for the Chinese to concede, impossible in such context. So the multilateral approach, which I hope Biden will pursue, might allow that degree of agreement, that sort of agreement on the way China behaves, to emerge. So I don't think, in other words, that we can expect the Chinese ever to concur with, well, you're going to remain inferior forever approach. But they might concur, I wouldn't say it's in any way certain, with a, well, you've just got to follow, you've got to behave more reasonably or less unreasonably, because you're no longer the developing country of 20 years ago. You're a vast superpower and you're competing everywhere. And that requires you to behave in a totally different way. You've got to stop pretending you're a developing country, for example. That's ridiculous. And then finally, of course, there's a possibility that what the West will try to do is simply to isolate it, to close it down, to reintroduce a sort of Cold War setup in which essentially they disentangle themselves totally from China. Well, that might be something China couldn't stop, but obviously they will find that immensely hostile, and it will make them feel that that's like the first approach, but even worse. That won't go well either. So in the end, the question we confront is, do we want 100-year conflict with China? And it will be 100 years. China's not going to go away like the Soviet Union. Or do we want to work out a way, a modus vivendi, even with a country with which we disagree on so much? And can we do that? That's, I think, a stupendous question. In my view, it's the biggest geopolitical question. But one final little point, if we don't work out a modus vivendi, we're never going to solve climate and lots of other issues which we really care about.
Martin, fascinating stuff. I just love the way you're pulling out the big threads that we should be following. Two more topics for you to prognosticate for us on before we go to audience questions. The future of democracy. You said recently some countries have shown effective responses to the crisis while others have not. Whether a country is democratic or not has not determined this difference. This is something, Martin, I've been thinking about throughout COVID-19. What is the cost to the perceived prestige, the perceived inevitability of democracy that has informed so much of our Western mindset for half a century now? How deeply has COVID scarred that perception of ourselves, and maybe more importantly, the world's perception of democracy as the preferred system for human organization?
Well, I think just as with the economic aspects we talked about before, in which I referred to the financial crisis, though I could have gone back over the last 4 decades. Similarly, on this question, it's a much longer story. And it's very important to put in that context. The problems or the issues didn't arise with COVID-19. They just clarified them and illuminated them, just as they have in the economic side. The economic side has shown the weaknesses of our economy and the inequalities that are embedded in our economy. And I think that's also been true in a different respect, politically. Larry Diamond, who's one of the world's leading scholars of democracy, teaches at Stanford, has been using the phrase democratic recession, where we have been since the middle of the last decade, so about 2005, 2006. And Freedom House, very well-known American think tank, has been providing figures, and other scholars, and I've been using some of their charts in my columns, have all shown an increasing dissatisfaction across the world with democracy since about 2005-06, made worse by the financial crisis quite clearly, which was also a shock to the same countries, as you indicate, and the competence of the British and the Americans and the Europeans was all thrown into question. And we've seen long before this event the shift to autocracy in a lot of emerging and developing countries. The looking for more autocratic, strongmen sort of rulers. You see it in Modi's India, in Bolsonaro's Brazil, in Erdogan's Turkey, in Duterte's Philippines. Of course, you saw it across the former Soviet Empire, in Russia. We would say democracy never really got embedded, but also in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Hungary. So there's this phenomenon. And then finally, we saw, of course, the election of Donald Trump. I'll put Brexit aside, which is sort of special, though it has some of this flavor. And Donald Trump is perfectly obviously a man with autocratic instincts and leanings who's emerged, he's not been particularly concealed it, within the world's most important democracies. So this was what it was like before, as it were. Then COVID-19 comes along, and it's very, very interesting. Because what COVID-19, I think, has shown, apart from its obvious economic weaknesses, is that in response to a crisis like this, what matters, and that was the point of this quote, is whether you've got a government that actually cares about governing, which is somewhat distinct from how it's selected. Is it democratically emerged or is it authoritarian? Vietnam and China, of course, let it happen, but China then throttled it amazingly. I have to say, it is amazing. Vietnam controlled it incredibly well. And so did South Korea, and Taiwan is astonishing, and New Zealand and Australia, all quite vibrant democracies, and they've handled this very well because they have populations that trust their leadership, they have effective governments, and they know what they're trying to do. So you've seen effective autocracies, authoritarian states, and you've seen effective democracies dealing with it. And what they have in common seems to be there's a social trust of some kind, trust in government orders, and a capacity to implement things. And then if you look at the failures, well, you've got a lot of these autocratic or borderline autocratic governments which have got elected have turned out to be actually just performances. The people who run them are showmen. They have no interest in actually governing. Donald Trump has shown this very clearly. It was also true for Boris Johnson, who emerged as a result of Brexit. It's very clear in Brazil. These are people who just like the performance of power, not actually the reality. And I think they've failed very markedly. But so have some genuine democracies, or more or less genuine ones in Europe. So the failures include some of these what I think of authoritarians who don't actually want to govern, performance politics, and some democracies that just aren't very good at governing because the people don't trust them. They don't have very effective government systems. So I think what's emerged from this, and this is very important, I think, as a part of the reaction to the era starting in the 1980s when we had to, I always use this quote from Ronald Reagan, who said, the 9 most dangerous words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." This is a famous watchword of Reagan's. And for 3 decades, that sort of was a dominant idea. What the financial crisis and this has shown is actually we need governments. We want governments. And if democracies don't provide them, then, of course, people will be tempted to go for effective autocrats. And effective autocrats, in some ways, are much more frightening than ineffective ones. Alternatively, they might actually decide, well, why not have an effective democratic leader? And I think that's what Mr. Biden had going for him. People thought he would actually take this seriously. So it's a very complicated issue. But what I think, the core of where I think we are, is that the people of the world want governments to work because they've realized as a result of COVID-19 that having governments that work is actually rather a good thing. And we're going to have to deliver it. So if we're Democrats, we have to support governments that work.
Great insights, Martin. Our last topic that we want you to prognosticate on before going to audience questions is the future of globalization, something which you're often associated with, going back to your books and writing. You said recently, quote, globalization of goods has already slowed after the 2008 financial crisis. It is likely to further slow post-COVID-19. The multilateral system is likely to be further eroded. Have we reached peak globalization? Are we now on the downward curve, Martin?
Well, there are at least 3 or 4 elements in this too. So there's no doubt. So let's know the things we know. Up to the financial crisis, we had an extraordinary period in which trade grew much faster than GDP for the world as a whole and for most major countries, not all. So that was a pretty clear measure of globalization, and it coincided over decades with large liberalization efforts, of which the most recent one was China's accession to the WTO, to the World Trade Organization in 2001. And the big feature of that, very clear in the charts, of that globalization was supply chain integration, supply chain unbundling across frontiers. A lot of that to do with the emergence of China as a provider and integrator of components of the supply chain. And that that impulse reached its apogee in the financial crisis and has basically been dwindling ever since. So the supply chain unbundling slowed, the trade growth ceased to be faster than output growth. And I think there were basically 2 reasons for this. One, liberalization stopped. We haven't had a really large liberalization of the world, anything in the world economy since 2001. That's now quite a long time ago. And associated with that, but also for other reasons, much of the opportunities to unbundle supply chains have been exhausted. Real wages in China are catching up on the rest of the world. There is no other economy that can replicate China because they don't have the scale and the resources. It's become, therefore, increasingly economic to bring supplies back home. All that was before the crisis hit. So that's sort of the beginning, the longer history. Then, of course, COVID-19 made it very, very clear that if supply chains get too unbundled and too concentrated in one place, you'll sort of start looking very vulnerable. So the immediate impact of the crisis was a lot more restraints on trade, desire to bring production back home. Companies which got caught out by lockdown started saying we've got to diversify supplies, including back home. I don't want to overdo that. But it was clearly important in making people feel actually there's a degree beyond which we can't go. And of course, the friction between the US and China and the desire to decouple the 2 economies has been an important factor here. And that was clearly reinforced by what's happened in this year. And I referred to that already. So there's the COVID-19 shock, which has reinforced this idea we've got to decouple. And then finally, we don't know what's going to happen with multilateralism and the WTO. The Biden administration may or may not try to use the WTO as a lever. It may just try to approach China using its allies, or may be somewhat more bilateral. We don't know, but I think it's about as certain as anything can be that the Biden administration will not regard a huge new trade liberalization as any sort of priority. It has so many other things on its plate. So we can assume, I think, that there won't be any great liberalizations anywhere, and that at best, trade in goods is probably going to mark time. Although there are some glimmerings. I mean, China itself is likely to emerge as a huge destination for goods trade. In fact, far and away the biggest, already close to it. And that might be another engine of world trade, particularly for the Asian countries, the ones close to it. But in general, I think it is plausible that trade in goods as a driver is, for these reasons, various reasons, is not likely to return as a significant force in the future. However, and this is the final point, I'm not going to go into financial flows and all the rest of it because it just takes us too long. But what I call virtual globalization is quite likely to sort of explode, and this can affect a very large part of services. I mean, we have learned that we can organize production in the service sector. Indeed, we can organize production in the manufacturing, but then at the end of that, there's some real things. But we can organize production in the service sector to a remarkable degree without everybody being in an office. It doesn't then matter where they are in the world, they can be anywhere. Our technology allows interchange very freely. We can also introduce more and more robots, and we can control them across borders. So that means that there's an awful lot of what we thought of as service stuff, which we could actually organize cross-border as easily as we can within our economy. Virtual offices, as it were, virtual factories. The full implications of this are very unclear, but they could be absolutely colossal because remember, the service sector is the biggest part of our economy. Now, of course, there are some bits of this, like tourism. You've got to be where you're being a tourist, which won't be affected. But in the health sector, education sector, entertainment sector, as I said, the organization of offices, I think we've just scratched the surface. A friend of mine, Richard Baldwin, wrote a very fascinating book under a hideous title called Globalization, which it describes this possibility. And I think it is possible that this accelerated use of virtual integration that we have experienced will now mean that areas where you really can't impose trade barriers, you can't stop people talking across frontiers or sending data. Well, the Chinese try very hard, but you really have to try hard. It may well be that this virtual push will create a new form of globalization of a very great depth and whose implications yet we don't fully know.
Fascinating stuff. We're now going to transition to audience questions. So 2 announcements to make to our viewing audience. First, that if you have questions, please send them to us now at dialogues@monkdebates.com. We're going to put them to Martin, get you some answers. And second, for those of you that would like to join us for our post-dialogue Q&A, members Q&A, please do so. We have, as usual, Janice Gross-Stein of the Munk School of Global Affairs coming on to give us her reactions to Martin's presentation today, but also to talk about the U.S. election, what this means for Canada in terms of our trade, security, our role in this world that Martin's been describing to us, a world of increasing conflict and tension between China and the United States, in a world where an exporting nation such as Canada is really going to have to find a way to make trade work in its benefit. To join that post-dialogue members-only Q&A, please sign up for a membership if you're not already a member, and you can do that at monkdebates.com/membership. We'll email you a link to join the dialogue as soon as you've signed up tonight. Also, please note that if you are a member, you should have that link already to your email account that you have on file with us. Okay, Martin, it's now time to get into audience questions because this show is in large part a dialogue with our audience. We've got a number of them, so I want to try to get through these, as many as we can, with you. This question is from Malcolmson. He's asking, what do we need to do now to prepare to fight the next pandemic? Great question. It's on everybody's mind. You must have been thinking about this a lot these last months.
So I think actually on the economic side, we've sort of worked out what we would have to do, and we hope we will be able to, that the circumstances allow us to do so. Um, it's very clear that if a country has the capacity to create a really good safety net, and it already exists, then it's very much easier to ramp it up than the creative from nothing. So that means poor countries find it very difficult to deal with this. Developed countries find it better, and countries that have established welfare systems do much better than those that don't. But that's something you want already. The other to prepare, sort of, it's a basic safety net. The bigger things on the economic side is better support that we need. It's a very big lesson. I've been talking about this recently with people, is we need much better support for health systems. And in developing and emerging countries, the pandemic is a global phenomenon, so we need it to be cured everywhere. And we need systems that will get cures, both treatments and vaccine, to developing and emerging countries very, very quickly. And there's a very big question about whether, in this case and in future, we're going to be able to do that. The World Health System, if you like, is colossally underfunded. I mean, just staggeringly underfunded. And so we don't have a capacity to respond globally. And it's a series of national responses. That's clear. And then, obviously, in terms of the health system itself, we can't be sure what the next pandemic is going to look like. It might not be this sort of disease, as I understand it, but we are clearly going to go over this and to make sure that we have the basic capacity to produce essential materials. So we're going to have to look at the supply of plausible essential materials and how we ensure we have the capacity, storage and production capacity. We've done, I think, extraordinarily well on the science and innovation side. So I'm not terribly worried about the response there. Has been amazing. But the final thing I think we've got to learn from that is pandemics are public health emergencies, public systems emergencies. And they have, what has been revealed here is our public systems, of which health is a central part, in many developed countries and in most emerging and developing countries, are really weak. And so we haven't had the capacity to do quite straightforward things like testing lots of people, quarantining lots of people. And we're going to have to think about how we develop those capacities.
Thank you, Martin. Let's go to our next audience question for you. It's from Edward. He's asking, why do you think many reputable media outlets have failed to understand the U.S. electorate? For 2 elections in a row, the press's election expectations have been upended by the actual preferences, seemingly, of voters on election day. What do you think of that, Martin? I mean, we went through this in 2016. We had a series of predictions going into that election, a huge upset. This time, Joe Biden looks almost assured to become the next president, but all of this talk about a blue wave, a surge of Democratic support that would win the U.S. Senate, that would add seats to the House instead of losing seats for the Democrats in the House, which would potentially even upend traditional Republican strongholds like Texas, other Midwest states. None of that came to pass. I mean, is it time to put polling on the ash heap of history and just move on?
No, I think there are two very interesting questions. First, it does appear that the methods of pollsters are underpolling certain sorts of voters, and probably quite difficult to get to voters, and voters who are quite suspicious of the sort of people they get polled by, pointy-headed elites, as it were. So voters inclined to vote for what one might think of as somewhat right-wing populist causes, particularly people from the working classes, people like that, they seem to be getting underrepresented in the polls. And by the way, this happened in the Brexit referendum. So they have to look at that. But that's very important. But the second point is, the problem is we're asking polls to do something which, in my view, they can't do. Because of the perfectly normal and well-known margins of error. We would like to know precisely the percentage share of the vote that different parties get. If it's going to be 52-48, we would like the poll to tell us it's going to be 52-48. And of course, if it actually turns out to be 50-50, the poll looks catastrophic, doesn't it? But the difference between 52 and 50 and 48 and 50 is really small. It's a 2 percentage point margin. So in this case, it's an error either way, roughly a 25th. And an error roughly a 25th is really a small error when you're dealing with the behavior of millions and millions of people, and you know that your polling sample can never be fully representative. So the problem you have is that really quite small errors proportionately of the number of people who will support a particular side have enormous consequences for electoral outcomes. Mm-hmm. And trying to predict something when small proportional errors of the support you get is actually, I think, pretty close to impossible. So we're asking them to do something which is very important for us, which actually can't really be done. It's like I have exactly the same, I like to say this about forecasting. Economic forecasting is widely a joke because it's so often wrong. So, and the reason is, let's suppose somebody forecasts growth at 2% and it turns out to be 0. Well, that's a huge difference, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But in terms of the error you've made of the economy, it's actually 2% of the economy. That isn't a very large error. And the size of the economy next year, it's incredibly easy to make that error. And the point is, we're trying to forecast differences, which actually we can't do very reliably. So I think the polls are quite useful, as long as you understand they can't answer the question you'd like to answer them to answer, which is what exactly will the vote share be in this election? Right. And the trouble is they only know that within a margin, which in certain circumstances can give them a completely wrong result.
Good to remind us of some of the math here, Martin. I appreciate it. Let's go to our next audience question for you. Up on the board now, it's from Peter. How do you feel there is potential hope for a Biden presidency to rein in Wall Street and push back against the current boom and bust cycle that seems to pervade much of the global economy and that is extenuating the inequalities of income and wealth? And maybe just to expand on that, because I know economic inequality is something that you've thought about for some time now. I mean, you have experience in the World Bank before becoming a journalist and opinion writer. What should we make of having gone into this crisis with so much collective societal anxiety about rising economic inequality, only to see it explode now to levels that were unimaginable a mere 12 months ago as a result of the policy response to the very pandemic? It seems as if we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't.
Well, this is such a immensely complicated set of questions. How many hours do you want me to reply?
You've got 60 seconds.
The question that you started with, how much difference will Mr. Biden make? I'm afraid, and I wrote a column about this, which I recommend, of course, that it's not going to make much difference. First of all, the forces generating rising inequality, leave aside COVID-19 for the moment, I'll come to that in a second, are very powerful and long-standing. And they're global forces, of which I think technology has been the most important. The arrival of China was also important. That at least is in the past, so that might help. But the old industrial economy of the mid 20th century, which generated high wages in sectors, industrial sectors for relatively unskilled workers, mostly male, uh, um, who, when the West essentially had a monopoly of industrial know-how, all that's gone in every possible way. It's just gone. It'll never return. We're not going to have that economy. And we haven't generated an equivalent economy which can employ people like that at market determined decent wages. And that then starts raising all sorts of. So you have to change very profoundly how labor markets work, economic opportunities, and so forth. And then over and on top of that, in my view, we've generated rentier patterns, rentier capitalism, problems with competition, problems with naturally forming monopoly, problems with financialization, which have emerged in the last 40 years, which are very difficult to deal with and complex. And some countries have done much better than others, but it's involved a lot of working against it to do well. Mostly, the Northern Europeans have done quite well because they've worked against it through the state. They have a much bigger state. So there are huge questions about, because the forces here are so big. Now, then there are just 2 points. So, Biden's problem is he doesn't have a bad set of programs, though, of course, he's not very deeply radical. But of course, he has donors who will expect him to look after them. And Biden doesn't look like having a majority in the Senate, or at the very best, it'll be 50-50. And he's not going to be able to transform the economy. The last truly transformative presidencies in the economy in the US were, of course, the FDR presidencies. And that was unique. I mean, he won 4 elections, and basically he ruled Congress. That's not going to happen again. So I think you cannot expect. You can expect improvements, and I think there will be important improvements, but a real reversal of everything just doesn't seem plausible. And meanwhile, then we get to COVID-19. COVID-19 has emphasized 2 things. One, there are lots of insecure workers, many of them minorities, of course, the young, the less educated. They are very, very badly affected by this, and that's not surprising. And women have been more affected than men, which is in contrast with what happened with trade, because the service sector has been so damaged. The face-to-face service sector has been so damaged. Now, that's just revealed and underlined fundamental inequalities which you knew existed, which was exacerbated by the nature of these closures. The impact of this particular disease, who could continue to work and who couldn't. And then, as you point out, the financial sector was saved because we couldn't let the financial sector implode by Fed action. And in America too, and some other countries, by enormous help to corporations, which I think was really overdone. That's partly because of politics and partly because you can't have the financial sector implode. However, I would indicate that we don't have the data yet. My guess is that the inequalities that have emerged, what's happened in the stock market, of course, it's been boosted, but while it will have worsened wealth inequality somewhat, wealth inequality was so extreme anyway. Nearly all the assets are owned by such a small proportion of the population that the inequality will not be dramatically increased. It's just very high. Income inequality, I don't know what that's going to look like. Actually, since the crisis in quite a number of countries, income inequality has not worsened. It's a more complicated, since the financial crisis, it's a much more complicated picture. But the basic point I wanted to make is there are very deep-seated structural forces generating where we are. We need really to think quite systematically about how far we can overturn them. That's a big question, and I don't expect the Biden administration to do more than improve things, but not reverse them. But improving them is itself going to be very hard.
Martin, just to build on that for a sec, because you're painting an interesting picture here of a fundamental restructuring of the workforce that we knew in the immediate post-war era, a workforce of automation, of virtualization, and layered on top of that, the potential tendency, a trend of increasing wealth inequality. So is something like a universal basic income almost inevitable at this point if we want to think through how we actually can politically hold together, especially democracies that require broad societal consensus around the goals that are being pursued together? Will we see inevitably out of this crisis a significant wealth transfer from those that have done well out of this pandemic to the rest of society through something like UBI?
Well, there are two aspects to that question. The first is, will we, as a matter of fact, see a significant wealth transfer in society after this? And my guess, my prediction is no. I think the people who do well, who are doing well, are sufficiently powerful and sufficiently well represented in the political system, dramatically so in the US, but in many other countries too, that they can hold the line against that, because it would involve enormous increases in taxation. And one of the things that is most striking, if you look at the OECD countries in tax ratios of tax to GDP, is they vary a lot. You know, there are high tax countries and low tax countries. And here I'm looking at general government. So for federal systems like yours or America's, I'm adding up local, provincial, and federal, or local, state, and federal. But they don't change much. They really don't change much. So Denmark has been a high tax country for a very long time, and the US and it's been a relatively low tax country for a long time, and the ratios haven't dramatically changed. What this tells one is that it's really hard to change taxes. And if you're going to do it significantly, you will end up taxing a lot of people, and they will resist massively. So my prediction is, whether you like it or not, tax ratios won't shift. And that links with my UBI view. If we move into this, which some of my friends believe will happen, in this automated world in which basically almost all unskilled jobs and a lot of skilled jobs will just disappear, you know, human beings become like the horse in the 19th century, which is a sort of fear, then we either have UBI or people starve. And I assume in that case, probably, who knows, we'd have UBI. It's not where we are now. It's nowhere near where we are now. Most people can get jobs. Employment ratios are fairly high, leaving aside COVID-19. Most people can get jobs. They're just not very well paid. So that argument for UBI, you can still, in other words, support people through employment. Now, then you have the question, is the best way to support people is by making those jobs better paid, by a mixture of higher minimum wage and wage subsidies and income tax credit, or through the universal basic income, which provides incomes to everyone. While the former focuses on workers, relatively low paid workers, and probably adds in support for people who are in particular difficulties, disabled people, lone parents with small children, people you really want to load up help on. That will be one bundle, and the other will be sort of universal basic income, which goes to everybody. Now, if you want to go with universal basic income, and if you want to be sure that the people you really care about, who are the groups I've talked about, low wage earners, people with relatively modest skills, people with serious problems in working for all sorts of very good reasons. If you want to do UBI and make sure that those people are all covered, you either have a minimal UBI and you keep the rest of the welfare system, or you go for a really high UBI. It's a really high basic income. And to do that, you have to raise the average tax ratio to sort of Scandinavian levels. I mean, we're talking about enormous increases in tax ratios. And I think that's just a politically infeasible proposition. So As I said, it might have to happen in the future, but in countries with relatively low average tax rates like yours or mine, let alone the US, it's just not a feasible proposition to get a universal basic income which provides an adequate income, genuinely adequate income for everybody, which replaces the rest of the welfare state. So you then end up with a relatively modest universal basic income, which erodes still some of your special help for people who are in trouble. And I don't like that because I think the
Hmm.
poor will be really hit. I think the important thing is to raise the people at the poor and middle low levels, not provide this massive churning exercise, which is what you do when you raise taxes on everybody and everybody gets it back. So I pay a lot more tax and I get it all back. So I think the at the moment, I believe that we're going to have to target it more. But I do recognize the problem. If you go for targeted assistance through the state system, it lowers the average tax burden, but of course it means that it does look as though it's only going to those people, and you don't want to do that. So it has to be complemented by very strong basic services, and that's why you need enormously powerful universal health systems, universal education systems, universal child support systems, and universal pension, along with the special assistance for the relatively poor people.
Thank you,
And to
Martin.
me, that's a much more sensible way of going than universal basic income. And this is purely pragmatic. There's no
Hmm.
ideological element in here. I just don't think we can make universal basic income work politically at a sufficiently high level to support everybody in the way we would want.
I've got it. We're up against the top of the hour. You've been very generous with your time. But before I let you go, we've been asking all of our dialogue participants to recommend books that we should be reading, that we should have at the proverbial bedside table to try to understand this moment we're in. You've given us 3 books, and maybe you could just get a quick synopsis from you of each of them. The first is Deaths of Despair, a fascinating book, but just give us a quick sense of why you think people should be turning to Deaths of Despair to understand this moment.
Well, this is a book by Anne Case and Angus Deaton, who are a couple, very, very distinguished academics. And its basic point, they discovered the shocking fact that life expectancy of white, non-college educated Americans has been falling. Was the first time for decades that anything like this had been observed. It was shocking. And they discovered that the main reason was opioid addiction and other forms of addictive behavior. And this can be ascribed to the deep failures of the American health system, overprescription, all the rest of it, and despair. The fact that many non-college educated white people felt they were downly mobile, the American dream had gone, they couldn't sustain marriages. And it's a horrifying indictment of a failing system, which we've been discussing. And it raises a big question about, can this be improved? By the way, a similar thing is beginning to emerge in the UK more recently. So it's not unique to the US, though not as extreme.
And with big potential political ramifications. Your next book on your list of 3 was Trade Wars Are Class Wars.
Yes, this is by 2 friends of mine. Well, actually, I know all these people. Matt Klein used to work at the FT, and Michael Pettis, who works in China, is a very distinguished economist, a business economist, financial economist. And basically what they was trying to say, look, Donald Trump, you don't understand why there are trade imbalances. You think this is a trade policy problem. It's not a trade policy problem. It's got nothing to do with trade policy. It's a macroeconomic problem. The problem is that some countries have massive excess savings, and the way they found to resolve this is to park them in the US, to lend to the US. And the current account deficit is US borrowing. And the way the US has handled this is by endless excess leverage in their economy, excess borrowing. And I wrote my book on the argument that that created the global financial crisis in significant measure. But the key point in their book is what causes this excess savings? And their answer is all across the world, we've got increasing shifts in income away from labor towards capital, that and towards the owners of capital. And these people own so much they don't need to spend, so they save a lot. And as a result of their saving so much, when they don't really have much investment opportunity, consumption is weak, is these huge trade imbalances which are generating trade wars. And if we don't understand these problems, we can't fix the thing that Mr. Trump was so concerned about. I think it's a very powerful, slightly complex, but incredibly powerful
No,
perspective.
I'm going to check that out. And your final book for us by Gene Sperling, Economic Dignity.
Yeah, I think this is interesting because it might well be influential with this president. Gene was, of course, a very senior economic advisor to Barack Obama. He's very well plugged in among the Democrats, very highly respected, a sort of centrist to left. I like him very much. And the book basically says, well, what are the things we've really got to do to make our economy work? And the problem we have is a huge part of the people we've been talking about feel they've lost their dignity. They're not properly independent. They can't earn enough to support a family. They aren't treated at work in a way that is dignified, which gives them personal respect, avoid a sense of humiliation. They don't feel they're being fulfilled in work. And there are two responses to that, he argues. One is what he calls inclusive dignity, is policies that make people feel they matter and that they can build family lives and so forth. And that will take much more action than before. And the alternative is what he calls exclusive dignity, which is the dignity that comes from saying, well, I may be terribly badly off, but at least somebody else is worse off, often an ethnic minority. And so that starts ethnic wars, the sort of frictions you've been seeing. I think it's a very powerful argument. It's very attractive. It makes clear how difficult this will be to do. But if I were a Biden, I would think this is the key to unlocking the great puzzle, which is why so many people for whom Mr. Trump did nothing, absolutely nothing, still voted for him. And the answer is because at least he gave them the dignity of respect.
Well, thank you, Martin. You've helped us this evening unlock a whole bunch of big puzzles that were on our minds, and you've done that with your usual sense of incredible breadth of knowledge at your fingertips that you're synthesizing through that terrific column at the Financial Times of London, your books, and your public speaking. So on behalf of the Munk Debates community, thank you so much for coming on the program this evening.
It was an enormous pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was Martin Wolf. I want to remind viewers that in just 5 minutes or less, we'll be starting our post-dialogue members-only Q&A with Janice Gross-Stein, reflecting on a lot of Martin's key ideas that he's put forward for us to think about tonight, and also talking about the impact of the U.S. election on Canada. And again, if you'd like to be part of that dialogue and you're not already a Munk member, join right now and you'll get an automated email link to log on to the members only dialogue. You can join for free at www.monkdebates.com/membership. We'll also put a link to membership and how to register online on our Facebook page. I want to thank the terrific group of partners that have helped make this series possible. First and foremost, the Peter and Melanie Munk Charitable Foundation. Great to have their ongoing support for all these dialogues. And Onyx and Gluskin Chef are presenting sponsors. We'll be working busily over the next week to put together our subsequent dialogue airing next Wednesday. Our guest will be none other than former Munk debater Anne Applebaum. Anne is one of, I think, the world's smartest commentators on this increasing struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. That's coming up on November 18th at 8 p.m. Eastern. Anne Applebaum, more information on our website. We've also got other great speakers on tap for you. Again, we're going global here after the U.S. election. A lot of international voices here. Zhang Weiwei, one of China's most respected thinkers and academics, is going to give us a thought on how China is responding to the U.S. election, to the pandemic, and more. Those are just some of the terrific speakers that we've got on tap for you in the coming weeks. Finally, let me thank all of our distribution and content partners. They're a big group and they do a great job bringing all of this to people around Canada and around the world. Tories LLP, Bond Brand Loyalty, and you saw up there Cassette Media, and here are distribution partners: CPAC, GEM, Facebook, Indigo, WNED, PBS Buffalo, and our friends at Canada's national newspaper, the Globe and Mail. I'm Rudyard Griffiths. Thank you for being part of this Monk Dialogue, being part of our community dedicated to civil and substantive conversation on the big issues of the day. We'll do this all again next Wednesday. In the meantime, have a safe and productive week.